What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamoda and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, Danny? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I can't complain. I am speaking with you, right?
Yeah, that's true. Speaking of speaking, I think there's a correction that we have to make for the last episode. Just a little squirmy bit that you made. Do you remember what I'm talking about here?
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about Teutonic plants. So in our last episode here, so Henry is famous for butchering some words and phrases sometimes, like how things are pronounced. And I think we've come up with probably the culminating, word that I would love to just start putting on like Bro History merch or something like that.
Teutonic plants.
Teutonic plants. Now he meant to say tectonic plates when we were referencing the geographic, the geography of Japan. And oh man, that one I had to mute myself temporarily because I nearly like spit out my water. Yeah, that was hilarious. I've even on our Patreon channel, I even made a mock-up of a Teutonic knight riding, the piranha plant from from Super Mario Brothers. What do you have to say for yourself, man?
Well, at least I didn't refer to our audience as bro historians.
All right.
So whatever. Danny I may mispronounce everything, and I really do. I'm terrible at pronunciation. And it's not just difficult words, it's easy words as well. I'm bad at that. Yet I still do a podcast. So it proves that anyone can do this. But one time we were in an interview with Zoltan.
Zoltan Istvan, yeah.
Zoltan, what's Zoltan's last name?
Istvan,
who is a an ex Nat Geo writer, big transhumanist, running for president.
Past tense.
He's like, Danny was like, hey, can you tell all our bro historians, like, who you are and what we're doing? And I was just like, bro historians.
Hey, I was trying to make it a thing.
Bro historians.
Clearly it didn't stick with you. My bad.
It sounds like something that would come out of the marketing department at like Hanes or something. Or Dude Wipes.
Bro historians.
What's up, bro historians? Come join me for a six-pack.
All right. Fair enough. We both fuck things up.
All right. Well, what we're doing today is that we're continuing our series on Japan. And this is I don't want to say part 2 because then it gives the impression that you can't listen to this on its own. And I guess we're trying to make these episodes so that you can listen to them on your own, but they're also part of a larger series, which may be impossible as far as I know. I think it is impossible, but who knows? We're going to try to attempt this and go into this uncharted territory anyway. But this is we're trying to explain the creation of the modern day Japanese nation state, and we're doing this by diving deep into the past and starting with ancient Japan on through classical Japan to feudal Japan to Tokugawa Japan to imperial Japan, all those Japan, all the different forms of Japan, and we're trying to explore how that nation state was made. So we're coming in this almost in doubt with not a preconceived theory or hypothesis. This is a learning experience that we think that it would be fun for other people to join us on. And last episode, we mainly focused on early Japanese civilization. We spoke about the first migrations of people of Japan, so the Jomon and the Yayoi people, the influence of the Asian mainland on early Japanese culture, and then the development of the first political institution, specifically the Yamato Kingdom. So today we're going to be talking about the transition from this early civilization to classical Japan, to ancient Japan in their court system, and set up how feudalism became, the main system for about a 700 year period.
Yep, definitely. And just some specifics of the recap this way, just you don't feel like you missed anything in case this is the first episode you're jumping on. Couple of things to know from interesting points from the last episode here. Nobody really knows where to start, to pinpoint the start of humans in Japan. It could be anywhere from 500,000 to 30,000 years ago. Obviously, huge spread. I think the general agreement is that people walked over to Japan through a land bridge, and I always love the opportunity to say the word land bridge on this episode because Henry hates it. At least that's the correct,
hate the word land bridge when it means road, because some people use the word land bridge just to refer to the word road in like a modern context. They'll be like, oh, we need to block the land bridge from Lebanon to Damascus. You mean like a highway that goes there? No, a land bridge. It's people just trying to sound like they're playing chess. So the land bridge, but in the context of like a literal
bridge,
land bridge that was made to connect a island to the mainland continent. I think that is an acceptable use of the term.
Right. So kind of moving along a little bit there, it's one of the important points that we discussed about learning about the ancient Japanese is that it's super hard to know anything with certainty, because a lot of the ancient burial grounds and lands there are still coded as like either natural preserves or like they're owned wholly by the emperor today and you can't dig them up. So there's still a ton of mystery and a bunch of myths surrounding Neolithic Japanese history. But that's actually what makes it kind of interesting. I dive very specifically into a bunch of conspiracy theories about like aliens and shit surrounding it, which is probably all bullshit, but it was fun to think about. And then we talked about the Jomon people. I know Henry brought that up again as well. So they're a pretty diverse set of people. Their genetic makeup, has backgrounds, and connections to different Asian groups, including, Mongols and Chinese and Koreans and South Asians. Later, when we're talking about the Yayoi invasion, it was a mass migration event that happened over several decades. Actually, maybe hundreds of years. I forget the exact numbers again. You'll have to listen to the old episode again. This kind of describes this giant, ethnic migration over into Japan that was, made of people that were lighter and taller and, that brought a bunch of new technology over to, Japan, like bronze and rice and things like that. And it also set up how the Yayoi people were primarily dominating the south and southwest areas of Japan, whereas the old Jomon people tended to stay towards the north and the northeast. And what's kind of important to know about the Yayoi period is that it marked that transition out of the Neolithic period and into a period of recorded history, specifically, when the Chinese started writing down things about this land of Wa, or the land of dwarves out there that had 100 warring kingdoms, and that was totally batshit crazy. And that's how they referred to Japan in those histories. But it was really a shift from prehistory to history. Huge leaps forward we saw from hunting and gathering to cultivation, from stone tools to metal tools. We saw fixed settlements spring up. We saw social hierarchies being developed. It was basically the makings of a state, if you will, like the real embryonic state, if you will. And now today we're going to talk a little bit about what happened after that immediate proto state in the Yamato period that saw like a pretty big expansion of population. And what came as a result of it was this court system and this not feudal, I should change that, this classical period in Japan, right? And that's going to be the point of topic for today. And I think today's episode is going to be less about people and places and events, and more about the general theory and tropes that you saw from how this classical period rose and how the classical period fell and what did it fall to.
We're going to be focusing on Japanese ancient Japanese tax theory. So this is something that if that excites you, imagine if that's something that you would bring up in a job interview. I was like, oh, so
ancient Japanese tax theory.
do you have do you have your CPA? No, but I do have knowledge on ancient classical Japanese tax reform. I can help you with
land
that.
tax reform.
Well, I do have my I've read a couple of books on the classical court system and how tax shifts created the foresight for eventual feudalism. And they'd be like, "Okay, you're hired."
I promise it's not that.
This guy won't shoot up the office for sure, right?
I promise this is not as boring as it sounds like on the face of it. Like, yes, technically speaking, we are going to be covering quite a bit of like tax reform in classical Japan. But actually, what's interesting about it is how I'm not going to give it away. You'll have to listen. Just trust me on this one. It's not nerdy or boring.
All right, so it is extremely nerdy, but it's fun.
Not boring.
It's if you by definition, if you're interested in this, you are a dork. Sorry, we're dorks. If you are interested in this, you are a dork. Just face it. So something I discovered is that Japanese historians, especially in the early 20th century, don't look at this period in a favorable view. All right. Not all. The ones that I've read in the late 19th, early 20th century, and the reason why I read I like to read books and documents and journals from previous times to get a sense of what other people are thinking from different cultures and different time periods. And it's really fun. It's really entertaining to go read things from like the 19th and 20th century and how they write things in the context of their time. And usually it's unapologetically racist and sexist and very, very blunt. It's very funny. But I have a quote from Kanachi Asakawa, who was a historian at Yale. And he was like one of the big Japanese ambassadors to America. He was like a goodwill ambassador between the U.S. and America. This was before World War II broke out. He was a guy who really he really pushed for good relationships between Japan and the United States. But he has interesting work, and I actually read a lot in preparation for this series. But he has a quote: "The 7 centuries of feudalism were preceded by about 4 centuries, 794 to 1185, of court culture at Kyoto, the imperial capital. This culture was in its essential characteristics aristocratic, effeminate, and emotional.
Effeminate.
Its point of view was mainly aesthetic, not ethical. The denizens of the court, ladies and ladylike men, concerned themselves not so much about the right or wrong of their conduct as about the gracefulness of their behavior. Rather than asking what ought to be said or done under a given circumstance, they inquired how to say or do things approved by common consent to be good form and pleasing. Their culture was model. While it excelled in grace, it lacked strength and variety. Its point of contacts with the individuals were dull and void of thrill, for it hardly touched his capacity for strenuous effort or self-denying enthusiasm. If you picture in your mind the French court life under the old regime," he's meaning Louis XVI, "you will have produced a likely replica of the court culture of the Kyoto of the 10th century."
Sick burn, Asakawa.
So what he is saying, and I think that's a really good analogy, and that's an analogy that I've constantly seen up. Classical Japanese court culture was very similar to the court culture in France, in Louis. And the main similarities is that when Louis XVI was in power before the French Revolution, that was actually a high watermark for like French culture and French philosophy. This classical Japanese period was a high watermark for art, for Japan developing its own unique culture with its own language and own writing style and own system, kind of their own unique architecture and poem and literature and things like that. But at the same time, there was a massive disconnect between the aristocrats who lived in Kyoto, the capital at the time, and the rest of the country. They were very, very fancy.
They didn't have nearly enough pinkies to hold up when they drank their tea.
Exactly. Not nearly enough pinkies. Let's go back to the theme of their relationship with China. So they had a very kind of big brother, little brother relationship with China. A lot of their aspects from their culture were developed from China. Between the years 500 and 800, Japan was heavily influenced by the Tang Dynasty. Mm-hmm. So they adopted the Chinese systems of government, technology, writing systems, religion, etc.
Lots of stuff.
We're going to go deeper into this we're going to do a Patreon episode on this very topic to get more into the specifics, because this can take an hour and we're going to lose track about China's influence on Japan. So we're actually going to post this in our Patreon if you want to learn more. But to sum this up, Japan based its government off of Tang China, a very strong centralized government. But there came a point where Japan was no longer a primitive culture. Mm-hmm. They were reaching a state of culture maturity that was ready to develop on its own line. And what accelerated this process was that the Tang Dynasty was falling apart by the 800s. There was a major rebellion around 860 AD. And then for the next 100 years, China is ran by a bunch of warlords. Mm-hmm. Which is a common theme in China.
We explore that a lot in our episodes on China.
So, and if civilizations were like stock markets, China was in a slope at this period. Mm-hmm. And then the following dynasties after the Tang Dynasty, they didn't have enough. They did not have the same amount of prestige as far as military prestige or just territorial integrity. They had actually a lot of developments in like science and art and stuff like that. But as far as land mass, the following dynasties were not as big.
Yeah, their geopolitical strength was very much weakened.
And frankly, China lost a lot of its appeal.
Right.
So
wasn't
in
cool
the
anymore.
800s, Japan just stopped sending their missions to China anymore, underneath the guise of, hey, it's too dangerous, we can't send these people because they're at war at this period, there's pirates off the coast of China. It's just a civilization that is falling apart. So they stopped sending people there. And the greatest sign of the divergence between Japan and China is that around this time, Japan started developing their own writing system. Mm-hmm. Previously, the Japanese, if they said something and wanted to record it, you'd have to write it down in Chinese. Right. And what makes that a huge pain in the ass is that the Chinese alphabet is not phonetic. So being literate required the brutal process of memorizing thousands of characters.
Well, I mean, you still have to do that today with modern Japanese and Chinese and many other languages. So while it is brutal for someone who was not previously literate in that language, if you're brought up in the court, I think it was kind of second nature.
Well, in Japan, though, the language that they created, I'm not an expert on languages, but Chinese is not. They're all sight. It's all by sight and memorization. I think there's a little bit more of a phonetic component to Japanese characters.
100%, yeah. I mean, I'm studying it too. So they developed kana and hiragana thereafter, which were still character based, but they were phonetic characters, right? But they still use kanji, which are the Chinese characters, and there's still hundreds of thousands of them. I don't actually know the full amount, but there's thousands and thousands of them. And they kind of use them in tandem with one another, where kanji or the Chinese looking characters are useful is, in place names and in names and in a lot of different contextual stuff. But anything and everything can be written in kana or hiragana. And those are the phonetic versions. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, but how they started diverging away from China. Part of that was, getting away from using their system and using a system that was more suited to their language, right? So transliterating their, is that the correct word? I might not be using that word correctly. The word I'm looking for is a word to describe going from the sounds of your language to to symbols representing the sounds of your language rather than symbols representing words. Anyway, that was a long-winded statement.
No, I don't. I'm really bad with other languages, so it's beyond me that you could use 3 different alphabets for any within your writing system.
It's a tough language for someone who isn't born into it. I think for Japanese people that's just second nature, and for children it's easy because children are sponges for language. Our brains are hardwired to do it. But to that point though, if you were raised in the court, it was super easy for you to learn all these Chinese characters, and it was just part of the boredom of court life. They just straight up do calligraphy or something fun, and that was just an easy way for them to learn it. But for your generic rural people, or even your feudal lords that were just trying to communicate on paper, that it might have been harder for them.
Well, let's talk about the early woes of the classical state.
Sure. Well, I think while it's true that this early medieval period saw some pretty big expansions and innovations in art, it wasn't totally all sunshine and flowers and shit. So the majority of the common people there suffered quite a bit under many of the Japanese ruling class of the time. In particular, there was a lot of poverty, famine, definitely a whole lot of overtaxation, which we'll talk about at length. But all those things were a huge burden for the common Japanese person. One big issue that I'd love to jump into is the land allotment system. And since the Taika reforms, the Great Change reforms that came out in 645, so just before this period that we're covering, there was this established and honestly pretty progressive precedent of awarding land to people. So everyone was given land allotment every 6 years, and even women were given land allowances, public land allowances, which is quite a departure from the Chinese system, which only was extremely patriarchal in that sense. But I know that you had a few things to point out about that, Henry.
Well, the fact that this backwater country, because Japan was still the backwater, right. It was its most eastern place in the world. Well, at the time, at least.
China's New Zealand.
Yeah, at the time for these people, it's the fact that they were able to replicate China's political system is really hard to believe, and it's a complicated subject. So I have another quote from another older historian, Edwin Reicher, who was an ambassador to Japan and wrote a bunch of books in the 70s and 80s. So this is an older book. But nevertheless, it was, honestly, I think it might be the best, good general history book of Japan I've read. A slow erosion of the tax lands and financial base of the central government had set in already during the 8th century. From the start, the capital and provincial aristocracy had retained the bulk of their lands as tax-free states under the classification of rank, office, or special merit fields. And these rich families were the people best able to expand their holdings through opening new fields. Mm-hmm. They also were so situated in the government as to be most capable of increasing their tax-free privileges or even winning the right to have estates made immune to government inspection. So, what this means is that they're messing with the tax codes. So people would in the court system, they would get in with the court and they would make tax law. Basically, it's a lot like how our government works, like how lobbyists will basically write bills, mm-hmm. or how politicians just. They create policy to favor their friends or favor their donors. Mm-hmm. That's what was going on with this government, like many other governments. Cronyism. So these people were messing with the tax code. Between the 9th and 12th centuries, much of the agriculture land was gradually transformed from tax-paying public domain into private agriculture estates called shons. A shon is I'm not reading from this anymore. A shon is a feudal holding, but in reality, it's just a way to farm out tax exemptions. And the main point is that the growth of the shon undermined the central government's ability to collect tax revenue and therefore redistribute that land. Sorry, so I'm reading again from this. Often made up of scattered tracts of rice fields, these estates were sometimes owned by powerful provincial families, but more commonly by the great court families in major Buddhist and Shinto institutions of the capital region. The estate system was quite complex. Right to income from the estates, called shiki, were divided among a whole hierarchy of persons or institutions. At the bottom was the actual cultivator, with his family workers and hired hands. Above him was the controller of the state, usually a family of local prominence acting in theory merely as a manager for the proprietor, would be a protector. Some even more powerful families of religious institutions. The system of multiple incomes from a single piece of land is reminiscent of conditions in medieval Europe. Even those areas that were not turned into private estates, but remained part of the public domain and under the control of the provincial governments, took on many of the characteristics of the estates. Appointments as governors of certain provinces became hereditary rights of particular families, and they assigned the functions of local control over these lands to aristocratic provincial families, often on semi-hereditary basis. Thus, the control of income from these lands were privatized in much the same way as those of the estates. The net result of this was a steady loss of income and functions on the part of the central government. The elaborate Chinese-style central government had progressively less to do, and as a result, increasing emphasis was placed in the ceremonial aspects of the government. Although the effectiveness of the central government is gradually atrophied and a number of noble families and religious institutions become its multiple successors as the real controllers of the land, Japan's insularity saved it from foreign conquest and the usurpation as might have occurred under comparable conditions in China.
Let's unpack that a bit, because I think there's a lot going on there, and I want to bring it down to the ground a little bit and give you kind of paint a picture for you. So we're talking about these feudal holdings, and we're talking about land distribution. And previously I also was talking about the awarding of federal lands, right? So public lands were being given and granted to people, and those lands were often taxed pretty heavily, right? So if you were awarded some land and you worked that land, you were due some taxes to the federal government. But what was interesting about this was a kind of supply and demand issue. So there wasn't enough suitable land to distribute and keep up this system for forever because they had such a huge growing population. And it was basically like a classical, socialist overextension of welfare. But it didn't need to be that way. So like a big problem was that the agricultural technology of the day sucked in Japan, so much so that they weren't able to clear, land efficiently. And even land that was already previously cleared to make rice paddies and stuff like that often went under-maintained and just basically went to waste. Typical government, can't do shit, right? So they couldn't keep up with their own land management. And they were also taxing the land that was in use pretty heavily. And that went on common people's shoulders. And one thing that I think is important that you pointed out in these quotes is the relationship that the religious institutions played into this. Because in our last episode, we were talking about how the expansion in Buddhism in Japan was basically seen as a useful tool to help unite people under one ideology. But, to expand its influence requires Buddhist temples. Lots of them. So in particular, there's this one emperor. His name is Emperor Shomu. He was between 724 and 749. He was super into creating and expanding Buddhism. He was actually responsible for this really huge building called the Todaiji building. It's actually the largest wooden building in the world, which is pretty interesting. And it's got a giant Buddha statue in it. So he created that, but he also had the bright idea to put temples in every single province. And all of these state-sponsored temples and places of worship came at a big price tag, which all of these commoners were footing the bill for. So Shomu's Buddhist kick, I think it's not entirely clear, but a lot of people seem to believe that it was inspired by like this giant smallpox epidemic that happened prior. So this epidemic actually killed off almost a third of their population at the time. So that might be some like divine realization that he had. He's like, kind of like coming to Jesus moment, coming to Buddha. But what he did was he created some taxation reforms during the time to help the peasant class, and then instituted a bunch of new policies. And one of these policies allowed peasants who cleared land for themselves to keep that land. And if they cleared it, many times they were not going to tax them for it. They wouldn't tax you for that land. So it was like kind of a double whammy, right? We had this lack of land, and that was a problem. And we had just poor management of land, so they outsourced it to the people. And so this started showing us like a shift from state land ownership to private land ownership in Japan. But all these reforms and policies, they really didn't help the majority of the peasants who were still way, way, way overtaxed by local religious institutions and also local landowning nobility. All this is to say that it caused just a shit ton of migration within Japan of the peasant class, and this was because of the incentives, right? There was these tax-friendly, like privately owned estates that were elsewhere outside of public lands that you can go to live and work. Unfortunately, those people got robbed blind by those landowners too. But this migration from the state-owned and taxed lands to private-owned and untaxed lands was really the beginning of the decline, I think, for the court system and the power that the courts had in that centralized imperial authority. And this kind of brings us to what's called the Heian period. So the Heian period is like 794 to 1185. I don't know if you mentioned that already or not. I'm going to say it again. The Heian period was basically marked by the movement of the capital from Nara to Heian, which is present-day Kyoto. And Emperor Kamu at the time, he's the dude who moved it. No one really knows why he actually changed
the theory. You know what the theory is?
What?
There was too much of a Buddhist influence there, so he was trying to escape it.
Yeah.
That's the speculating theory, but nobody knows.
Yeah.
But I've read that like a bunch of different times. Everyone's like, he must have wanted to get away from the Buddhist influence.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair point, because they were getting pretty strong. Like these Buddhists, they weren't like peace monks and stuff like that. Like they had conscripted armies and shit. Like they had warriors, and they had real strong sway over government affairs. It wasn't a pushover like religion.
No, it wasn't like the hippies that are like, I'm Buddhist now. Like, hey, like what religion do you practice? I am actually a Buddhist.
No offense to practicing Buddhists, of course, but these guys were like legit powerhouse players, like evangelical Christians in the U.S. here. They were
an institution,
right? Right. And another theory that I read actually was that he thought that the land was cursed because of so many disasters that happened, like the smallpox epidemic, but also like, earthquakes and shit. Or he might have just been bored. I don't know. Nobody really knows. But the point is that he moved the capital to Heian, and that's why we call it the Heian period. But this is the capital that stuck, because prior to this, they bounced the capital around probably like 100 times or some shit like that. I don't actually remember the exact number, but they moved the capital.
It's something that it's not even worth figuring out unless you're a very hardcore Japanese historian. But yeah, whenever an emperor would die, they would raise the capital to wherever his estate was. Right. So imagine if every single president of the United States, instead of like them moving to the White House just became like wherever they were from.
Wherever it was that they were.
Scranton, Pennsylvania will be capital of the United States. I'm just a kid from Scranton.
Scranton. Yeah.
Trump's Mar-a-Lago.
Mar-a-Lago? No. I don't know. So
in Arkansas.
Okay, so they moved the capital. This one stuck. This one lasted more than 1,000 years, actually. So what's important about the Heian period, there's a general overview here, is that we see two really critical things happening. We see the growth and the ultimate decline of the court system, and we see the growth of the strength of the private land ownership. So let's talk about the court system for a bit.
You can see where this is going, though, right? Everyone listening to this, you can see where the seeds of feudalism are growing at this period, with the decline of the central powers and the growth in power in private land ownership. And we'll get to eventually, the decrease in power within the central government will be a further reliance on these power players in the rural areas to supply men at arms. But I just want to kind of give you a sense of where we're going with this.
Right. So this court system. So we kind of poked fun at it a little earlier, especially with quotes that I had, especially some of the bits about it being super effeminate and silly. But actually, the Heian period saw some of the best art, literature, and cultural works being created in all of Japanese history. So whenever you think of like a book or a painting or some poetry or some style of theater of Japan, you name it, it's probably coming from this particular period.
I thought a lot of that was from the Tokugawa period.
So there's a lot that comes out of the Heian period, like a lot. And the interesting thing about this is that the reason why so much of this art and early art and writing and culture that comes out is because of just how crazy disconnected from reality the court system was. So these great works mostly were created from members of the imperial court or their families, or the ancillary vassals and things like that. And during this period of artistic expansion, we start to see a lot of these elites pull farther and farther away from their core responsibilities of governing, and just started messing around and doing fun stuff instead. Sounds oddly familiar for today. But here's a quote that'll help with this. This is from A History of Japan from Stone Age to Superpower by Kenneth Henschel, which is actually one of the primary materials that we used for the last episode as well. So he writes, nobles of the day debated the merits of flowers or seashells, or floated wine cups to each other along miniature waterways, or composed delicate verses. Their values centered not on matters of state, but on the correct protocol, the proper costume, the perfect phrase. So basically, we're just like
meaning they're a bunch of silly nannies.
Yeah, they're just being like silly. You know, like they weren't really paying attention to anything but like what was fun or like what was, you know, proper. I don't even know the correct set of adjectives to utilize for this, because on the one hand it feels like they were just sitting around, like, you know, for lack of a better word, just like circle jerking each other, or, you know, but at the same time there was also like a kind of like a political thing. You know, it was super weird. It's kind of hard to describe.
I think it's important to discuss this, because this happens in almost every government, in every nation, in every country. There is always this elite culture that is developed within the elite of that country. And I hate using the word elite, because elite makes it seem like these people are superior.
Right.
You know, they're just born into the right family.
Right. It's all circumstantial.
But this is a group of about 20,000 people.
Right.
Japan at this time has a
5 million or something like that. Yeah.
Has a population of 5 million people. It may not seem like a lot, but for the 5th, 6th, 7th century, 8th century, that is a lot of people. 5 million people.
Yep.
They give you a comparison. China at this time probably has somewhere around 50 million or so. Don't quote me on that. Mm-hmm. I think that's what I've read from a couple different sources, that it's like 50, 60 million people.
But that's all of China.
Nobody knows.
You know?
That's all of China, and China is huge. It's big. China's big and populated, and they have mountains, but it's not covered with mountains like Japan is, where everyone has to live in these, like, you know, 4 population zones.
Right.
It's a lot more territory. Japan, on the other hand, is highly populated at this time for its landmass. But before I lose my point, in the beginning, I mentioned that there was very similar to French court culture with the powdered wigs and the let them eat cake type attitude, where there was such a massive disconnect between the people who are wealthy and in power, and then the common person on the street. And you even see that today, right now. There is we have absolutely nothing in common with Nancy Pelosi, or nothing in common with
the political in general. Yeah.
So, all right, let's put it this way. We have way more in common. Like an average Democrat and an average Republican have way more in common than either of them have in common with Nancy Pelosi and
Mitch McConnell,
Dan Crenshaw, or someone like that. You know, like, these people are on a different level of they live a different lifestyle, and I think there's we see that today even with like Hollywood celebrities. Yeah. Like Lady Gaga just paid like a $500,000 ransom to get her French bulldogs back, right?
Yeah, I heard about that.
Is that Lady Gaga?
Yeah, that was Lady Gaga. But I think you pointed out the correct word, and I think it's power, right? For the people in power, because a lot of times what happens is there is this culture that establishes with the people in power, and I'm going to use that with like light air quotes. There's this just like, you know, set of unspoken rules and regulations and customs that they have. And so when you want to secure power for yourselves, you want to bring yourself closer to the people in power. So if you are a minor lord in Japan or a landowner in, you know, France, you're going to go to the court and you're going to try and adopt their proceedings, right? So you're going to dress the same way they do. You're going to speak the same way they do, in the hopes that you can get closer to the seat of power for yourself. And that's distinctly different, and probably the cause of the demises here, from where the actual like real power lies. No quotes, and that's with who actually on the ground governs and rules and directs and leads the people and the land. So there is a huge difference between those two, like the air quotes power and power.
And since we're talking about ultimately the nation state, to create a nation state, it requires the exportation of that culture to millions of people within a defined territory. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Japan being the 4 major islands, there's no attempt to do that here. There's not an attempt to export this court culture to the peasants.
Right. It's just like siloed in this small area with a limited number of people.
Now the difference between something like, a court system like this and then the rise of nation states that you see in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, there is a clear process of people trying to export culture, and usually it does come from the elites of society, even though I hate using that word, but the powerful of that society, the culture setters of that society. They're creating a culture to export to the masses, to the peasants, to eliminate local customs and to unite everyone under one defined culture with its languages and mythology and all this stuff that makes people a people. The difference is between a period like what we're talking about now and 700, 800s Japan. This is more like we're in like the year 800 somewhere, right?
Right.
The difference is that there's no mass communication at this time.
Right. There's
no ability to spread this court culture to anywhere outside of Kyoto. This is just something that
also, it's just like if we're being honest, it just wasn't pragmatic either, right? Like people were more concerned with like how to say something.
Well, this is rich culture too.
Yeah, Sorry. It's like rich people culture. It's
this
like
is rich
they're
people.
more concerned with how they spoke than what they actually got done. And so that was strikingly different than what happened on the ground, like in the actual like country. And this kind of brings me to the growth of the private land ownership. Because
lizard people culture. Mm-hmm.
So private land ownership, different from a lizard people culture, because I think at the same time that this was happening, there was also this deadly cycle being propagated outside, right? And this is kind of getting back to that land tax bit. So earlier we mentioned all the reforms that were put into place to help stimulate the economy, provide tax relief for some peasants, and ultimately just like grow. And we mentioned that the problem that the state was having was a lack of land to grow some crops and produce on. So they placed a whole lot of incentives to get people to clear the land themselves. And as a result, they wouldn't need to pay taxes on much of that land. So this created the start of the cycle that grew the power of privately owned land that ultimately led to the demise of the court system. So by the 10th century, the practice of public land allotment, that's when the government decides, hey, you get a land, you get a land, you get a land, right?
You get a car, you get a car, yeah.
Yeah, like that Oprah-style land allotment, that was over by the 10th century because part of it is because they ran out, and then also part of it is because private land ownership had increased. And by the end of the Heian period, just before like the Warring States period, almost half of all of the land was privately owned. And what's important to remember about that is that land taxation was the only form of taxation at the time. So decrease in the proportion of taxable public land means a decrease in the revenue stream of the central imperial government. They ain't got no money. Also important to understand is how that tax-free incentive of clearing the land worked against the interests of the imperial government. So on the one hand, I think it was super handy and important to get people to outsource the process of clearing land so that we can grow more crop and, grow the economy. However, on the other hand, offering this tax incentive, to say that, these private citizens could basically, get their own tax-free land was, pragmatically didn't work out, to like spread out to all of the peasantry. This was pretty much just propagating a system where, wealthy private citizens can get super rich and poor just continue to get poor. So here's an example. Picture this. Pretend you're a peasant farmer and you are living in, classical Japan, and you work on a publicly allotted plot of land, right? You got your little, half acre or whatever it is, right? And, up until this point, you've probably suffered pretty greatly under imperial taxation. They're bleeding you dry. You got kids to feed. You got so much to deal with. And then there's on top of that, there's also like natural disasters, like fucking tsunamis and shit. And there's also some man-made disasters, and there's like smallpox. There's a bunch of shit that's happening. So life isn't great right now. Suddenly, you hear that if you go to some less developed neighboring province and you put in the work, the backbreaking work of clearing that land to make a rice paddy, you can own that land outright. And you don't have to pay any taxes. Sound like a good deal, right, Henry?
Yeah, for a peasant, it would be a good deal.
Well, yeah, I think initially for most of them it was, but it doesn't stay that way forever. Let's pretend that, you spent the time, you cleared out your little patch of land. Now you got your own patch of land, and it's tax-free now, and you're living the good life, and you're starting to grow your crops. And, let's say a group of bandits decide to steal your crops just whenever they want. They're just going to come up and pluck your shit. And obviously you can't stand guard to protect your crop all day and all night, right? And you probably also don't have the means to hire some private security because you're a peasant. So what do? Maybe one day, a wealthier neighboring landowner decides to offer you a deal. And the deal is this. He goes, I'll buy your land, and you can actually continue to live there and work there under my employment. And for a small fee, I promise to provide ample security. You can grow as much crop as you like. You'll be much happier. And yeah, it's better than, the federal government land that you were on before. And you accept, probably reluctantly, but you accept anyway, because what other option do you have, right? You can't protect your own land that way. So later, this wealthy landowner repeats this exact same process with other small landowners, just like you. And he goes through this process of collecting more and more land and more wealth. And now this landowner has under his control acres and acres of land and probably hundreds of peasants and hired security. And now he has the means to start clearing more land all by himself. So he can now skip the process of purchasing land from people and just go ahead and clear out, acres and acres of land just for himself. And all he needs to do is spend a little bit of money on tools and cheap labor to do it. And in his greed and his lust for more and more power, he starts collecting more and more security fees from everyone that he employs. And this growth keeps going unchecked until ultimately it's more than what the central government was collecting in the first place. So I think you can see what's going on here.
Yeah, so the local powers became, the regional powers became way more powerful than the actual central government.
Exactly, because they're getting all the money and they're creating this like juggernaut where, and now they're sending, their people to lobby, and mess with the tax code, just like we were talking about earlier, and make it so that they don't have to inspect the land anymore, And like, what are you going to do? I've got, 500 samurai ready to like protect my land. This is my land. This is private land. I cleared it. I own it,
Yeah. And, you can see this trend, starting with the crony taxation, like going back to the court system Well, let's actually pull this back a little bit because I think it's worth mentioning the disconnect between the rural Japan and the court system. Again, we already talked about this, but what's interesting is that there's really not there's not much recorded history about rural Japan because no one was really writing.
No one's writing.
There's not really these court documents. We do know about the rural elite that linked the land to the countryside with the capital, but the elite in the these were like lesser nobility. You know what I mean? Should we go into like kind of like the early rise of the shogunate, or?
Well, I think I got like one more bit here for the divide of the court system and the the local land ownership, because one interesting part, and we can even include this with our example here, is that the decline of the court system was both internal and externally driven. So internally, we had this decrease in revenues from taxation. We had growing detachment of the court from reality, frankly, and a lot of the power going to land ownership. Externally, we had some other issues, and that was that we had this process of absentee land ownership. So what that is where this guy that we were talking about, the guy that bought up all the land. Now he was doing this to gain power and things like that. And now that he's got a little bit of money and he's got some influence, he's going to go over to Kyoto, and what is he going to do? He's going to adopt the same silly, frivolous court culture that all those folks there have, right? Because he doesn't want to be known as like the hillbilly guy, right? He wants to be known as like the wealthy, powerful landowner guy, right? And so he's going to spend most of his time at court. Most of the year he's going to spend there, and he's just going to appoint somebody, some upstart. Maybe it was somebody in his family. Maybe it's just somebody he trusts, right? To run his land for him. And those were like these appointed estate managers. And what's funny about it is that as some of these people were coming up and gaining power, they start abdicating their power in favor of going to the court systems. And the people who truly maintained the power were the folks that were out in the country working the land, because it started creating these pockets of decentralized power and influence among these private landowners. And specifically, and not to jump too ahead, because I know that we want to kind of talk about this in a future episode, but the widespread hiring of samurai happens at this point. Because remember, these private lands have to be protected somehow, right? We're not being protected by the empire or like by some conscripted army, which I don't even think that they had they totally didn't have a conscripted or a standing army. It was just like local militias. So we needed all these people to protect the lands, and those were the samurai. So the real center of power was who had the most muscle, who had the most samurai,
who was the military power at that time.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right. At that point, Japan, the court, there was no standing army anymore. And when you think about it, they never really needed a standing army the size of China.
No.
Japan already has so many natural barriers for protection. Mm-hmm. So the island, the fact that crossing this island you're likely to get killed by a tsunami like the Mongolians. Mm-hmm. Not likely, but it happens. I mean, there's a chance if you're
they got hit by a typhoon,
to Japan.
Still.
What's that?
They got hit by a typhoon, but still.
A typhoon. Chances are there's a huge risk in sending an armada from the Asian mainland to Japan, just because there's a lot of ships and weather can get real bad.
And even if you make it over, then it's like, ah, shit, now you're on Japan, and it's like rugged terrain. It's like mostly mountainous, as we were saying. So hopping from one pocket of like, population to the next is going to be hard. Plus, all of them know their terrain better than you do, and they're just going to do straight up guerrilla warfare on you. You're not going to make it very far. It's just not going to work.
It sounds like a Vietnam disaster.
Yeah.
That's why Japan was only invaded once in its history.
Right.
By the U.S. after firebombing it for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
But to give you a sense of like where the word samurai kind of comes up, the samurai were they were called gento before. And I don't want to dive into this too much because I know we plan on doing this in a future episode, like the actual like birth of the shogunate system. Mm-hmm. But just to give you kind of an idea of where the samurai come from, it's when there was no record of anything that was going on in these rural areas,
right?
And of course there were when, let's just say, if someone wasn't paying taxes and someone was taken to court by like a policeman, the records started being taken like later on, and that's where we get like our records of the first like actual samurai from their actual police activity being recorded within the shogunate courts. Mm-hmm. But I mean, they always were kind of there, you know what I mean? Like there were active fighters and military men.
Well, they were there to suppress rebellion too. When people were getting pissed off by this over taxation, they needed to do something to put down the insurrection, and that's where the samurai came in.
All right, I think we should end on that note. All right, thanks guys. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Bro History. It really does mean a lot that you guys continue to give us your attention and your time every week. It means a lot. So if you want to support the show, first you can rate and review the podcast. If you're on Apple, just go to the top right-hand corner where you see the stars. Press the 5-star review, write a review, say, hey, you guys are awesome, or hey, you guys suck. We obviously prefer saying, hey, you guys are awesome, but go ahead and do that. And then you can also support us on our Patreon account. We're going to be releasing extra content on there related to the Japanese subject. We're going to be doing an episode on Chinese influence on Japan, exclusive to Patreon, which will be one of many kind of supplementary episodes that we put on the Patreon that will go with the theme. Usually things that we didn't have time to talk about. So join us on that to get that episode. You can get an RSS feed and plug it into your whatever podcast catcher that you use. But yeah, I'm rambling on. I always suck at ending these things. Do you have anything to add?
No, man. I'm just super excited to talk about samurai next time. This is gonna be fun.
Me too, Danny. Me too. All right, peace, guys.
See ya.